Here's a question that has no comfortable answer. What if the biggest barrier to XRP adoption, getting banks to integrate new technology, has already been solved? Not partially, not in a pilot, not in a proof of concept, completely, silently, without a single bank having to make a technology decision. In March 2026, something clicked into place that most of the crypto space completely missed. A Singapore-based payments company called Thunes, which is deeply integrated with SWIFT, enabled stablecoin payouts to all 11,500 SWIFT-connected banks using their existing connections. No new technology required, no infrastructure overhaul, no onboarding process, no integration project. The routing chain is Swift Message, Thunes Network, Ripple on-demand liquidity rails, XRP as the bridge asset. 11,500 banks, already connected, right now. They did not opt in. They did not sign a partnership agreement with Ripple. They did not evaluate the XRP Ledger. They are simply connected to a network that is connected to a network that runs on XRP. The on-ramp was built around them, and the highway is already open. Welcome back to XRP News Flow Signals, where we track infrastructure connections, not just partnership announcements. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research. But if you want to understand why the Thunes Swift Ripple routing chain is the most structurally significant XRP development in years, and why it requires nothing from the banks to activate, stay with me. This one is precise. Let's start with the hard truth that almost all crypto commentary on bank adoption gets completely wrong. The assumption embedded in most XRP adoption analysis is that banks must choose XRP. They must evaluate it. They must integrate it. They must train their staff, update their compliance frameworks, and make a deliberate institutional decision to use a digital asset for settlement. That assumption is wrong, and the Thunes development is why. Here is the precise architecture of what just happened. Thunes is a Singapore-based cross-border payments infrastructure company. Their network connects to correspondent banks, mobile money operators, and financial institutions across more than 130 countries. Crucially, Thunes is deeply integrated with SWIFT, the global financial messaging network that connects over 11,500 financial institutions worldwide. In March 2026, Thunes enabled stablecoin payouts to all 11,500 SWIFT-connected banks using their existing SWIFT connections. No new technology, no integration project, no onboarding process. If a bank is already on SWIFT, and virtually every significant financial institution in the world is on SWIFT, they can now receive payouts through the Thunes network. Thunes network is integrated with Ripple's on-demand liquidity infrastructure, where XRP functions as the bridge asset for instant liquidity. The routing chain is already assembled and live. Swift Message, Thunes Network, Ripple ODL Rails, XRP Bridge Asset, Settlement. A bank using SWIFT, which is how virtually every bank in the world processes international messages, can now route payments through that chain without building a single new integration, without signing a Ripple partnership agreement, and without making any decision about XRP specifically. They simply choose to use Thunes for settlement on a particular corridor, and XRP handles the liquidity bridge in the background. This is not theoretical. SWIFT's new retail payments framework is rolling out to 50-plus banks across key corridors by mid-2026, and at least 30 of those banks already have direct ties to Ripple's ecosystem. Santander, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered, JP Morgan, some already using ODL with XRP for actual settlement. The technology adoption decision that seemed like the biggest barrier to XRP going mainstream was solved by building the infrastructure around the banks, rather than asking the banks to build toward XRP. The on-ramp exists. It connects to 11,500 institutions. They are already on it. Now let's run the numbers that make the Thunes Swift Ripple connection a supply math argument, not just an infrastructure story. Start with the market size that this routing chain is now technically capable of serving. Cross-border payments represent approximately $150 trillion in annual flow. The correspondent banking system that currently processes this volume requires pre-funded Nostro and Vostro accounts. An estimated $27 trillion in idle capital locked across banking chains globally, doing nothing except ensuring that payments can clear. XRP's on-demand liquidity eliminates that pre-funding requirement. Instead of a bank holding $10 million in a pre-funded account to ensure settlement capability on a specific corridor, ODL uses XRP as a real-time bridge, converting the sending currency to XRP, moving it across the ledger in under 5 seconds, and converting to the destination currency on the other side. The pre-funded capital is freed. The settlement is faster. The cost is lower. When 11,500 banks are technically accessible through the Thunes Swift routing chain, the percentage of that $150 trillion annual flow that could route through XRP is no longer a theoretical question. It is a volume question, and volume has a direct relationship with XRP supply. Now connect the supply picture. Exchange reserves have dropped approximately 57% from recent highs. Institutional accumulation exceeds $200 million in documented positions. XRP ETF products attracted $119.6 million in a single week, a record, with combined ETF assets approaching $1 billion, all removing tokens from the tradable float. In Q1 2026 alone, 12.4 million XRP were permanently burned through network transaction fees. That number grows directly with transaction volume, and transaction volume grows directly with corridor adoption through the Thunes Swift pipeline. The math: fixed supply contracting through burns, ETF custody, and institutional cold storage, against incoming demand from 11,500 institutions gaining technical access to XRP-settled corridors without a single adoption decision required. Now layer on the institutional momentum running parallel. Morgan Stanley launched a spot Bitcoin ETF at 0.14%, one of the lowest fees in the market, with 16,000 wealth advisors actively distributing it to clients. Charles Schwab, managing over $11 trillion in client assets, rolled out direct crypto trading for Bitcoin and Ethereum with stated plans to expand. Franklin Templeton and BlackRock are competing aggressively with staked Ethereum products. This is not Bitcoin and Ethereum adoption running separately from XRP. This is the normalization of digital assets as an institutional asset class, and XRP's payment infrastructure sits at the center of the utility layer that makes institutional-scale digital asset movement operationally viable. The highway is open, the on-ramps are installed, and the supply available to meet the traffic is already significantly smaller than it was 6 months ago. Now let's talk about the regulatory development that happened 4 days ago, because this is the event that changes the compliance picture for institutions evaluating the Thunes Swift Ripple routing chain. On April 16, 2026, the SEC held a formal roundtable specifically addressing the distinction between securities and digital commodities. This is not a casual advisory session. It is a formal regulatory process that produces official guidance, the kind of guidance that compliance departments at major banks use to make internal approval decisions. The Clarity Act is simultaneously gaining momentum in the Senate. The same legislative momentum that put XRP's commodity classification into SEC and CFTC documentation is now moving towards statutory codification. Here is why the regulatory timing matters specifically for the Thunes Swift Ripple adoption story. A bank that is technically connected to XRP settlement through the Swift Thunes routing chain still requires its compliance department to approve using that connection. The compliance decision is separate from the technical capability, and compliance decisions at major financial institutions are made on the basis of regulatory clarity, specifically whether the asset being used for settlement has a defined legal classification under federal law. XRP already has commodity classification. The Clarity Act will codify it in statute. The April 16th SEC Roundtable is producing the guidance documentation that compliance departments cite in their approval processes. The sequence, technical connection already exists via SWIFT Thunes, regulatory clarity being codified via Clarity Act and SEC guidance. Compliance departments at connected banks gain the internal authorization to use the connection that already exists. 3 stages. The first is already complete. The second is an active process. The third follows automatically from the second. And the banks are already showing directional movement. At least 30 of the 50-plus banks in SWIFT's new retail payments framework have existing Ripple ecosystem ties. Santander, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered, JP Morgan. These are not exploratory relationships. Several are already using on-demand liquidity for actual production settlement. The compliance approval is the last friction point, and the regulatory process currently underway is specifically designed to remove it. When it does, the 11,500 banks connected through SWIFT Thunes do not need to make a new decision. They simply activate a connection that is already waiting for them. I want to pause here, because mapping the SWIFT Thunes Ripple routing chain to the compliance approval sequence, to the supply math, to the institutional momentum running parallel, as a single structural thesis, is the analytical work this channel delivers every week. If this is the signal layer you have been missing, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals right now and turn on notifications. Because the mid-2026 SWIFT Retail Payments Framework rollout to 50-plus banks is the next datable event on this timeline. And you want the analytical context already built before that rollout produces its first published settlement numbers. Let's map the specific trigger sequence ahead, because the convergence of these developments is not vague. It has a defined timeline. Catalyst 1, SWIFT Retail Payments Framework rollout, mid-2026. 50-plus banks going live across key corridors, at least 30 with existing Ripple ecosystem ties. When the first published settlement data shows XRP-settled corridors running through this framework, the adoption story moves from infrastructure analysis to documented transaction volume. Watch for the mid-2026 corridor launch announcements. Catalyst 2, Clarity Act Senate passage. 2 issues remaining. Senate Banking Committee markup, targeted for late April into early May. When it passes, the compliance authorization that 11,500 technically connected banks need to activate the SWIFT Thunes Ripple connection is codified in federal statute. The decision that previously required regulatory risk tolerance becomes a routine compliance approval. Catalyst 3, Schwab and Morgan Stanley crypto expansion. Both institutions have publicly stated plans to expand beyond Bitcoin and Ethereum. Schwab with $11 trillion in client assets. Morgan Stanley with 16,000 wealth advisors. When either expands their crypto product suite, XRP's commodity classification makes it the most legally accessible expansion candidate. Catalyst 4, ETF supply lock acceleration. At the current inflow rate, combined XRP ETF assets approach $1 billion within weeks. At $119.6 million per week, the supply removed from tradable float compounds against an exchange reserve picture already down 57%. The supply that meets the demand triggered by the SWIFT Thunes rollout is significantly smaller than the supply that existed when this infrastructure was first assembled. Here is what the infrastructure picture produces when you hold all of it simultaneously. 11,500 banks technically connected to XRP settlement through SWIFT Thunes, today, right now, without a single adoption decision required. 57% reduction in exchange reserves from recent highs. $119.6 million in weekly ETF inflows, removing supply from float. 12.4 million XRP permanently burned in Q1 alone, compounding with every new corridor that activates. 30 banks already in the SWIFT framework with existing Ripple ties. Some already using ODL in production. The highway exists. The on-ramps are installed. The supply has already been reduced in anticipation of the traffic. The question is not whether the traffic arrives. The question is what price it arrives at. Let me leave you with the frame that makes all of this structurally clear. The biggest assumption in XRP adoption analysis has always been that banks must choose XRP, that they must decide, that they must integrate, that institutional adoption requires institutional action. The Thunes Swift Ripple routing chain just removed that assumption from the equation. 11,500 banks are already connected to a network that routes through Ripple's ODL infrastructure. They did not choose this. They simply remained connected to Swift, which is what every significant financial institution in the world does as a basic operational requirement. The on-ramp was built around them. The highway is paved. And as regulatory clarity codifies XRP's commodity status, the compliance authorization that activates those connections follows automatically. The adoption decision that seemed like the last barrier, it was never going to be a decision at all. It is an infrastructure connection that is already live and waiting. If this structural read changed how you see the adoption timeline, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals before the Swift framework mid-2026 rollout lands. We track the infrastructure connections and compliance sequences that produce adoption before the volume data makes it undeniable. Drop one word below. Highway if the Swift Thunes Ripple architecture landed as the signal it is. Let's see who caught it. Stay sharp. The signal does not lie. Not financial advice. Always conduct your own research.